There are folks that are considered Aristotelians today. In the list of philosophers that I gave you, Martha Nussbaum Nussbaum means nut tree in German, but she's an Aristotelian, uses Aristotle's philosophy to basically evaluate all kinds of modern problems. Another great Aristotelian is Alasdair MacIntyre, who's often referred to as an American philosopher, although he's Irish. I don't know how that happened, although even though he's an Irishman, his education was in Ireland. He's been a professor in the United States for practically his whole career, so I guess that's why people make a mistake. When you listen to him, you can tell he's Irish, and he's of the opinion that Aristotelian virtue ethics is the only real viable kind of ethical theory for Americans. And I should have explained that, and I didn't. But if you draw what I call a cognitive map, which is just a physical, pictorial way of thinking about the relationship of ideas, you kind of make it like a typical map. You put the I on one side, the self, basically, and the we on the other, the community on the other, and at the top you put certainty, and at the bottom you put uncertainty. The focus on the self, the eudaimonia of Aristotle, flourishing, individual flourishing, your individual flourishing, would be over here. So this is an Aristotelian point of view, essentially. Remember, he does consider the community as well, but the focus tends to be on how do you flourish as an individual. You need a good society, good family, good education, good, economy, all that stuff. But basically the concern is how do you flourish for Aristotle. Over here, a philosopher we'll look at later is David Hume, and he's thought of as being the communitarian point of view. It's the community that really gives you your ethics, and so depending on what part of the United States you're in, whether it's the 13, there's all kinds of different ways of talking about various cultural groups in our United States. And if you grow up in that community, you feel morally associated with those beliefs, as opposed to what you might have believed if you were in a different community, even in the same country, right? But David Hume is there, and the main ethical concern we have is the community's moral points of view, right? That's David Hume, right? When we talk about certainty, we usually refer to Kant, or at least I do, because he was the one that gave us the categorical imperative, right? And so when we're talking about morality, as we will see, he believes that everyone grows up with a categorical imperative. Categorical in the same sense that we recognize triangles and rectangles and so on, so you can categorize them immediately. And if you have a moral situation, you as a responsible, rational human being, says Kant, will know what the right behavior or the right action is. And that's the categorical imperative for him. Because morality for him is certain. But down here, we have who we will use, John Stuart Mill. And put John Stuart Mill down there, where utility, the British philosophy, the moral philosophy of the utilitarian, which is actually very similar to a pragmatist, which we are. So there's a lot of similarities there. But John Stuart Mill was product really of the time where Darwin gives us evolution and Mill gives us the evolution of ethics. In fact, they're two of their main books. The Origin of the Species by Darwin was published in 1859, and that same year John Stuart Mill published On Liberty. And the idea is that ethics is based on happiness. And how do we improve happiness for the greater number of people? Sounds a little bit like Voldemort, but let's not go there yet. We can go there later. But Aristotle, who gives us virtue ethics, is over here. And if you try to map where you end up being, I think birth is usually, in my mind at least, up here, where an individual starts off life basically unaware really of themselves, but primarily focused on the self. You know, you're hungry, you're cranky, whatever, you know, you need your mom to satisfy you, etc. But as you grow, you kind of move in this direction, I think, as a typical American, where your parents are going to give you an ethic that seems pretty certain. You learn what's right and what's wrong. Of course, once you hit a typical public education, you get drawn down in this direction, I think, because we teach science, and science is often considered to be critical of moral views, almost a clash. There's a new book that just came out by Francis Collins, who was the head of the Genome Project years ago, when they were trying to figure out the human genome, right? And then he was, I think, the head of the National Institute of Health or something he's retired now, but he's written a book called The Road to Wisdom. And he argues that you need faith as well as science and everything. It's kind of interesting. But our school system kind of gives you history. The history of whatever, and as you follow the course of history, you discover that Christianity became the religion of the empire when Constantine the Great, number one, allowed it, and then later on it was even accepted as the Roman Empire's religion, right? And so you actually had to be Christian in the empire, and so on. So it's history, and history is man-made. And so that kind of approach tends to generally lead people, I think, to a view that morality is uncertain in a good way because it's evolving. We're much more moral today than we would have been, say, 40 years ago or 50 years. Yeah, right? You get the idea that we're progressing, in a sense, morally. So that's kind of interesting where you end up. I like to argue that the dead center of my map is where pragmatism sits, and we're all, as Americans, we're supposed to be considered pragmatists, which would mean that we take a little bit of Aristotle's ethics, we take a little bit of Kant's ethics, we take a little bit of Hume and Mill, and there's other ways, of course, of thinking of those different points of view, and you put them all together, and you're kind of a confused person in the middle, trying to deal with all these different options and so on, trying to decide which ones are the right ones, etc. And in this, Alasdair MacIntyre, and I should show you him, because he's still alive, and he's also on my list. He looks older than that now, though, but he is has been a professor at University of Notre Dame, which, if you are not aware, is a Roman Catholic institution. And he's an expert on Thomas Aquinas, and Thomism is considered to be the dogma of the church still today. So he's an excellent example of that. So I should have mentioned him last class when I was talking about Aristotle's ethics. But any questions or anything on my cognitive map? Is that fun? It's kind of, You can make your own cognitive map. You don't have to accept mine. Although I was pretty thrilled in reading one of Francis Fukuyama's books. He wrote, which one was it? The Great, let me find it. The Great Disruption. He's obviously got lots of interesting books out there. But The Great Disruption, in that book, he actually used a cognitive map, called it a cognitive map, and gave almost exactly the same map that I've done here, except he put these two on the opposite side. It was just kind of fun to discover that I wasn't the only genius. I mean, the only person that thought it. Sorry, that's just fun. You have your flash drive, it's not in here. That's Paul. He forgot his flash drive.
All is well.
Yes. And all will be well in the garden. Sorry. It's from the movie Being There. I'm mentally, I can't call it mental illness because that upsets people that are mentally ill, so, but I have. All right, so that's fun. But what happens after Aristotle is gone? We have a whole series of philosophers that are referred to as post-Aristotelians, and when we look back at the test here, notice question 5, what philosopher we have discussed would you use to give a person guidance in leading a good life? And why do you think this advice would be the best, right? Well, the post-Aristotelians seem all trying to answer that question. Not only is Aristotle trying to answer that question, but the other philosophers that we clump together as post-Aristotelians, some of whom are actually contemporaries of Aristotle, are all trying to answer that same question, including those that we would say are still followers of Plato. And notice that I also, in this test, as the last question I have, compare Socrates to Jesus of Nazareth. In what ways might they be similar? In what ways might they be dissimilar? So you get that question. And by the way, it surprises me that some people think of themselves as Christians and don't pick Jesus as the philosopher. Is that such an odd thing to think of Jesus as a philosopher? Maybe. But the first one I think of in sort of a logical sense is Diogenes. Diogenes is a cynic. Cynic literally means the dog philosophy. And that's pretty easy to remember. We use the word canine, the canine core, etc. And canine is actually from that word cynic, the Greek word cynic. There are quite a few of them, actually, but Diogenes is the most famous of them. He's got some great lines, like, when Alexander and one of his generals, Ptolemy, probably was walking by and they saw Diogenes and they went over to see Diogenes because Diogenes was famous. And Diogenes was just lying there in the sun. And Alexander stood up and looked down at him and said, "Diogenes, is there anything I could do for you?" And Diogenes looked up at Alexander and said, "You could step out of my sun." He was blocking. And Ptolemy thought, uh-oh, that's it for Diogenes. But Alexander replied, "If I wasn't Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes." But what was the cynic life? Basically, the view that you can't actually know truth or anything of that sort all of those questions, that's the cynical part. You don't think any of that. It's all just nonsense. Why even think about it? It's just a waste of time. But also, he didn't try to do anything with regard to improving his life, really, apart from his thinking. The idea of the lantern is he went around in daylight with a lantern, and people asked him, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm searching for an honest man." So there's all kinds of fun lines about Diogenes. He lived in a barrel. He didn't really wear clothing. He was basically a homeless dude. And if you see people that are homeless here, and you think, and you ask them, we could get you a place to live, etc. And they're like, no thanks, I don't want any part of it. In a sense, if that's their reason for being there, it's because they don't want to deal with the responsibilities of home ownership, or going to a job, or taking care of things and so on. That's kind of like a cynic. That's essentially what his life was like. And so logically, his focus seems to me to flourish. But how does he flourish? By lack of stress, lack of interest in participating in all of the shenanigans that are going on in the community. None of that's for me. I just want to lounge around and even just beg for food. So a typical bowl goes with a cynic. Not much. The dog is there. I don't know if he had a dog, but it's because of the name of the philosophy. Now, here's an interesting aspect of this, though. Socrates was known to be quite bum-like. His wife was always henpecking him because he wasn't working and he wasn't feeding the family and all those things. He did have actually a profession, Socrates. He was a sculptor, and in fact he famously sculpted the Three Graces, which was the statue that was in the center of Athens for 500 years before something happened to it and it disappeared. But basically he liked to just think and argue with people and attend dinners that basically he was being fed, etc., by all of that. So in a sense, Diogenes is sometimes thought of as a follower of Socrates. And not only that, but there's an interesting book by Robert Funk called Honest to Jesus. And in this book, Robert Funk is one of the members of the Jesus Seminar, which I believe is something like 700 theologians that used to meet every 5 years to compare their studies